Welcome everybody. I'm glad to be able to be here with you today. Just want to share with you a little story. Earlier this spring, I guess it's been a couple of months ago now, Laura and I, my wife and I, decided that we were going to go shopping for plants. We were going to go take a look at the nursery that's at the edge of town here. And we wanted to go find vegetables, plants, all those things, to be able to put in the raised beds that we had made in our backyard and spruce up the front of the house and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's the first time we've been able to do that in our own house. And so we were really excited about it. And Laura and I spent, an hour or two, probably more, walking through the nursery and taking a look at all the different plants and all the vegetables and fruits and things. And we were walking through one of the greenhouses and we noticed that there were these big pots with these small tree starts in them as we were going through some of the vegetable area. And we were kind of curious what they were. And as we started to take a look at them, we noticed that they had different color tags. And there were tags that were green and tags that were yellow and tags that were orange. And as you may guess, we found out that orange tags meant those trees were orange trees, and the yellow tags were lemon trees, and the green tags were lime trees. And Laura and I got to talking about that and thought, man, wouldn't it be so cool if we could grow our own citrus trees? Wouldn't it be so cool if we could have our own lemon tree or our own lime tree? We could make fresh squeezed orange juice from our own oranges that we grew, or to be able to go and pick a few limes to squeeze on our tacos, or be able to use lemons for lemonade or for being able to put on food, it just was this cool idea. And so as we were walking around, we found one of the guys who worked at the nursery, and we began to talk to him about, hey, can you really grow citrus trees here? I mean, I know you guys have starts here, but is this the right kind of climate? I mean, do they actually grow here in town? And as we were talking with him, he's like, yeah, you can grow them. I know some people who have grown them, but you either have to keep it indoors in a room that's basically all windows, or you have to have a pretty big greenhouse in order to make it grow successfully. And as we were talking with him, it began to be apparent, you've got to be really careful with these things, especially in our climate, to make sure that you get enough water to the plants, because there's not enough moisture in the air. We don't have as much humidity as places like Florida and stuff like that. And you got to make sure that the planter is big enough, that the roots can grow big enough to support the tree in order for it to produce fruit. And there was just all these things that had to go into getting these fruit trees to grow. And as he was talking more and more about it, my hopes and dreams of having my own fresh citrus fruit became smaller and smaller and smaller. And it just, I'm not a gardener, and so I don't really think about those things, and it just began to dawn on me the kind of work it took to make those trees grow and actually produce fruit. It reminded me that Laura and I had been able to take a trip to Hawaii. Oh man, it's been a long time ago. But as we were in Hawaii, we went to the Dole Plantation and found out how they grow pineapples. And it was interesting to me to find out that there is a lot about pineapples that you don't think about. The fact that it can take upwards of 2.5 years for a pineapple plant to produce a fruit. And not only does it take that much time for it to produce a fruit, but it will only produce one pineapple, and then the plant dies. And that's all you get. And it takes the right kind of soil, and it takes the right kind of care and water and all this kind of stuff that goes into making sure that a pineapple can grow. And this morning we're talking about John chapter 15, and Jesus uses this example of a vine to describe his relationship with his disciples. And Jesus uses this example of the vine to help us kind of understand that the same kind of work that goes into growing a citrus tree or a pineapple goes into making a grapevine grow. Maybe some of you know or have grown grapes. Maybe some of you have vineyards. I don't know. But again, I haven't spent much time trying to grow fruits and vegetables. I usually kill things if I try it, so I leave it all to my wife. But if you're trying to grow a grapevine, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. I mean, I thought it was long that it took about 2.5 years for a pineapple plant to grow a pineapple. But it can take 12 years to get a mature enough grapevine to really produce the kind of fruit that you want. Not only that, but there's all kinds of things that go into maintaining a grapevine. Like if you let it grow too long, You'll never produce the kind of grapes that you want because the plant will put too much energy into trying to maintain a vine that is too long for it. Or there might be branches on it that you have to cut off in order to give enough sunlight. Like if you're growing a grapevine, you may have a lot of branches that are starting to produce fruit, but you might have to cut half of those off in order that enough sunlight and enough nutrients and enough rainwater and all that kind of stuff is getting to the other half of those vines to make sure that those grapes grow. If there are too many leaves on a grapevine, they can actually block the sun off of the very vine that they are growing on and kill themselves. There's so much stuff that goes into growing these grapevines that you never even stop and think about. And because, like I said, I'm not a gardener, you don't think about, or I don't think about things like the right kind of soil, or even the amount of rain you get in a year, or the kinds of things that grow around the grapevines. All of those things have a huge impact on what kind of grapes you're going to grow, how big they're going to be, how juicy they're going to be, how sweet or sour they're going to be. All those things are impacted by the way that they are grown and taken care of and the vine that they are connected to, and how well that vine has been taken care of, and how well rooted that vine is, and how well maintained that vine is. All these things go into that. And Jesus, in chapter 15 of John, starts talking about He is the true vine. Let me go ahead and read this for you. In John chapter 15, starting in the first verse, He says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given to you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." So if you can't pick it up, if you can't tell, Jesus is basically laying out two things here that He wants the disciples to know and He wants us to know. He's saying you need to stay connected to Jesus. And you need to stay connected to Jesus in order to produce fruit. Those are the two ideas. Those are the two main things that He wants you and I to get. He wants His disciples to get. That you have to stay connected to Jesus and that you have to bear fruit by staying connected to Jesus. See, for them, for the disciples, they were a part of the Jewish nation, right? They had been Jewish people for thousands of years by now, at this point. And for a long time, the Israelites, the Jewish nation, had thought of themselves as God's vine, like as His chosen special vine. That was not a new concept to them. They were so much involved in the idea that they were God's vine that on the doorway of the holy place in the temple, like as you were going into the building itself of the temple, there was a big, giant golden vine that stretched across the front of this temple. And people thought it was a huge honor to be able to donate gold in order to make part of the vine or to add a grape or a cluster of grapes to this grapevine. They even, during the Maccabees, while the Maccabees were kind of in control of the Israelite nation, while they were ruling or governing and kind of rebelling against Rome, right? They started making their own money, their own coins. And the grapevine was one of the stamps that they would put on their coins to symbolize the Jewish nation. They believed that they were God's chosen vine. And I mean, it wasn't for no reason. They had been referred to as God's vine several times in the Old Testament. The problem was that when God would refer to Israel as His vine, His plant, His thing, right? It wasn't very long before that came around and turned into probably a rebuke, into some kind of statement saying, hey guys, you were mine, you were my chosen grapevine, but you haven't done a very good job of that. A couple examples. One in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, it says, "I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out wine presses as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit." Another example comes in Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21, it says, "I planted you in the land like a special vine of the very best stock. Why in the world have you turned into something like a wild vine that produces rotten, foul-smelling grapes?" And there are several other examples where God says, look, I took care of you. I prepared the soil. I prepared the vineyard itself. I made sure that everything you needed was there to grow. And yet you have turned into these wild plants that don't produce anything worthwhile. And so there was this problem. The problem was that Israel, even though it was God's chosen vine, wasn't producing the fruit it was supposed to, right? It was not producing the kinds of things that it was supposed to. And the Israelite people, the Jewish nation, their job was specifically to bear fruit. Their job was to produce something that was worth the time and the effort that God was putting into them. Right? If you take a look at somebody like C.S. Lewis, he describes this process of God preparing them and guiding and directing them. He calls it the hammering process, right? Trying to refine them and turn them into the thing he wants. And yet, they never developed any kinds of habits or skills or relationships that would really truly honor God. Every once in a while they would get it, but it would only last for a short time, and it was only after God had to come in and rescue them from the things they had done to themselves. They weren't producing any kind of fruit that was of value. But that was their whole job. To put it another way, if you remember back to what was going on when God called Abraham to be a nation, right? To be his people, to be the beginning of God's people. He made a covenant with Abraham. And in that covenant, God said, I am going to bless you. But then he adds on to that, so that you can be a blessing to others, right? That was the covenant. I'm going to bless you and give you everything you need, everything you could imagine, because I want you to use that to bless the people around you, to bless the other cultures, the tribes, the nations, the world around you. And when that promise was made, it continues on, it builds on. Right? If you even take a look at what God does in the law, when God gives the law to the Israelite people, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 24, we find that the law says, if you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. Now, that law, it's just kind of one of those random laws that you find within Deuteronomy. But the idea behind it is when somebody comes by, they should be able to go into your vineyard and satisfy themselves. They should find refreshment. They should find joy. They should find fruit worth eating. And you should share that with them so that they can find the happiness that you have. The idea behind the law was going back to Abraham and saying, look, you have been blessed. Let that spill over to someone else. Let that be a help to someone else. What you are producing in you should be something that helps others around you. That was what God wanted from his people. But again, it never seemed to turn out exactly that way. That it never seemed to work the way God wanted it to. Not because God couldn't do it, but because the Israelites, well, they never really seemed to stay rooted in God. They never seemed to stay rooted in a good soil to draw up into themselves the things they needed to produce that fruit, right? That was the thing, though. It was, when you say the Israelite nation, you kind of say the problem in itself. They were focused on being the Israelite nation. They were focused on their culture, their heritage. They thought it was enough just to say, well, God chose us. They thought it was enough just to say, well, we have the law. We have the temple. We have the Ten Commandments. We have Moses. We have Abraham. We have all these things. That is where, and they started to draw those things up. They started to draw their nation, their culture, their history up. Those were the things that they were drawing their nutrition from. They were drawing up that energy from those things in order to produce fruit. But if you are drawing up things that are nationalistic, if you are drawing up things that are not rooted in God, but rooted in culture or in tradition or in anything besides God, what do you think the fruit is going to be like? I mean, you may still produce fruit, but it's going to be fruit that tastes like that culture, and fruit that tastes like that tradition, and fruit that tastes like those things that are not God. And when you are focused on your own culture and your own tradition and your own selves and your own histories, right? When you're focused on all those things, the nation of Israel, those things don't really bless anyone else, because all you're concerned about is preserving those things, your stuff, the things that make you what you think should be you, right? What I mean by that is when you focus only on, for Israel, being the nation of Israel, then when you produce fruit, that fruit is only focused on maintaining and continuing Israel. Not God's whole creation, but just the specific Israel people that God had chosen. And that becomes more and more evident. I mean, that's why they didn't want to accept Jesus as the Messiah, right? Because he didn't maintain that idea of Israel as God's chosen people. He tried to spread that out to everyone. We do the same things. We become rooted in all kinds of stuff. And it's not always bad stuff, don't get me wrong. But we become rooted in having the right spouse or having the right kind of kids. We get rooted in becoming important at our jobs. We become rooted in even tradition in the church, just like Israel. We become rooted in the way we do church. We become rooted in the way that we share the gospel. We become rooted in the way we present Jesus and not in Jesus himself. We become connected to and draw into us the stuff around Jesus, but not Jesus himself. I mean, just think about it. We think about the way we dress on Sundays. I know that sounds simple, but think about how people feel like they need to get dressed up and come into church looking nice, right? And that's not a bad thing. But if you are truly connected to Jesus himself, if you are staying connected in Jesus, then he sees you when you are eating and sleeping. He sees you all the time. Nicely is the way you connect to Jesus on a Sunday, then you have to stop and think, well, you better start dressing nicely in the shower. You better start dressing nicely when you're asleep, because even at those points, you should be connected to Jesus all the time. All the time, we have to be a part of who Jesus is, a part of Jesus, and he has to be a part of us. So, with all of that in mind, then Jesus comes into his disciples and he says, look, I am the true vine, right? He says, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. And he wants us to understand what it means to truly be the vine. For Israel, it had been their culture, their history, their tradition. It had been the law, the things that God had given them to set them apart. And again, that produced fruit that kept them separated, set apart from the world. And it didn't always bless the world. So, why is it important that Jesus is the true vine? What is it about Jesus that makes him the thing that we need to be connected to? Well, first of all, Jesus himself says that he is the true vine that the Father has planted. Jesus is saying, God has put me here to be the vine, to be the thing that you are connected to. Even in In Psalm, the psalmist writes in Psalm 80, says, "Return to us, God Almighty. Look down from heaven and see. Watch over this vine, the root your right hand has planted, the son you have raised up for yourself. Your vine is cut down, it is burned with fire. At your rebuke and your people perish. Let your hand rest on the man at your right hand, the Son of Man you have raised up for yourself." So in that psalm, the writer is talking about how Israel is supposed to be God's vine, but it's withering, it's being destroyed because it hasn't lived up to what God wanted. And I know you can debate and say it's meaning that God needs to resurrect the Israelite vine, but you can also see in there that I think they're starting to hint towards, this is Jesus. We need the real vine, the one that's at your right hand, the one that is really connected to you and rooted in you to be the vine. Jesus is the one that God has planted here. He is the one that God has intended from the beginning to be the real, true, honest vine. And that is because that Jesus is the only one that can continually, honestly, truly be connected to God, because He is God. He is from God. He has been a part of God from the beginning. And so there's no way that Jesus can exist away from God. His roots don't come up out of God and go somewhere else when they don't feel like being rooted in God anymore. Because He is God. He is with Him. Jesus stays connected to God. And by that, we are able to stay connected to God through Jesus, right? That's what he goes on to say. He says that I am a part of the Father, and the Father is a part of me. And if you stay connected to me, meaning Jesus, you stay connected to God. We need to be rooted in God. Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 says it this way. It says, "So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live your lives in Him, rooted and built up in Him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness." Paul says it again in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. He says, "I pray that out of the glorious riches He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ, and to know His love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with the measure of all the fullness of God." It's important to stay connected to Jesus in order that we can pull up all of this that Paul is talking about into ourselves. We can pull up His power and His love and His fullness, the full measure of God, into us through Jesus. We stay connected to Him in order that we can use those things to produce the fruit that God wants us to. But it also means that we've got to go through the pruning process if we're going to produce that fruit, right? Jesus says that the Father is the gardener, and He cuts off every branch in me that does not bear fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. It has to be done. We don't like it. We don't want to go through it. But pruning has to be done in order to make sure that we are as successful as possible at being God's vine, being the branches connected to Jesus and producing the fruit that God wants for us and from us, right? There are a lot of things in our lives that we think take priority, that we think we need to have. Again, going back to those things that, like Israel was rooted in their own tradition, and then we get rooted in things. Sometimes those have to be taken away. Sometimes we have to remember that maybe the right job or the job that we think we need isn't the right one for us. Or sometimes the relationship that we think is so important isn't the right one for us. Sometimes we think that we need to have, all kinds of activities or things, stuff that make us better, improve us, help us grow. We think that they're going to make us stay connected to Jesus, but we find out that all they are really doing is drawing energy away draining us and making it even more difficult to grow in the areas where God really needs us to grow. And that's hard, to let those things go. They're not always bad things. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But we have to learn to let them go in order that we're not wasting time and effort on things that won't actually help us. And God has to cut those things away. They have to be thrown off in order for the fullness of God, the goodness that He wants, to be used where it needs to be. Just like a vine can only be so long, we can only stretch ourselves so far before we can't really accomplish anything because we're spread so thin, we don't have enough time and energy to get anything done. And that's what God has to do. Sometimes He has to cut away those things in order for us to not waste ourselves. The cool thing about this, the important thing about this is that if we are connected to Jesus, that means that He is going through this pruning process with us. It means that He is feeling every cut. He is feeling every loss. He knows the pain and the hurt that comes from having things cut away. And He is able to sit there with us, to stay with us and say that I know it hurts and I feel the same pain and I feel the same loss, but we will get through this. And I think that that's an important thing for us to hear, that Jesus is in this with us. He is a part of this pruning process with us. And He says we will get through this together. If we stay connected to Him. If we stay connected to who Jesus is. But again, all of this in the end is for us to produce fruit. We are trying to produce something that will bless other people around us, right? Jesus wants us to stay connected to Him so that we can produce things within us. God will produce things in us that become a blessing to people around us. That somebody can come into our vineyard and taste the grapes and find the same refreshment, the same nourishment, the same sweetness that we have in our own lives. In the end, we need to be producing fruit, and we can only do that by staying connected to Jesus. And what He says is that we think it's hard. We think it's difficult to stay connected to Jesus. We think it takes going to church or doing the right things. We think it takes all these crazy actions. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say don't go to church, but in the last few months, we have struggled with this because how do we find ways to stay connected to Jesus when we're not supposed to go to church, when we're not supposed to spend time together, or we're not supposed to do all these things that we're used to doing as a way to stay connected? But Jesus reminds us that what He says you have to do to stay connected is simply love the people around you. In verse 9 of chapter 15, Jesus goes on to say, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in His love." That's it. That's the simplest thing. He says, all I need you to do is remain in me, and you remain in me, you remain in my love by doing what I command. And we think, oh man, we have to actually listen to commands. How is that loving? But then you find out, what is His command? To love others. This is my command. In verse 17, love each other. That's what it takes to stay connected to Jesus. In this time where we are trying to figure out how we go back to normal, how do we go back to meeting, whether it's outside or online or in different ways, how do we stay connected to Jesus? How do we stay connected to who God is? And how do we produce the fruit that He wants us to? We read our Bibles, we pray, we talk to each other, but the main thing that we need to remember is that God's command, Jesus' command, the thing that Jesus did that He was told to do by God was to love God's people. Love God's people. And that means everybody. Love God's creation. And we are to love people around us. We are to love even the most unlovable. That's how we remain in Jesus. And that's how, through the pruning process, loving people is not always easy, believe me, I know. But through that, we are able to produce something that has an effect on the world. That's what Jesus wants his disciples to understand, and that's what he wants us to understand. We stay connected to Jesus because he's the one that is truly rooted in God. And by staying connected to him, we pull up into ourselves. Jesus puts into us the things we need in order to live a sweet life. Live a life that is juicy. I can get away with saying that. We live a life that is worthwhile, bears fruit. Just like Paul said in Galatians, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. We begin to build those things up in ourselves, and they pour out into other people. And people can come by and taste those things and refresh themselves. How refreshing is it for someone to come in contact with people who they honestly feel are telling them the truth nowadays? That they know they can believe, that they can rely on, that they're how much or how important is it for people nowadays in this time right now to have people that they feel like they can rely on? I mean, that is huge. So that's what Jesus has called us to. That's what Jesus was telling his disciples and what he tells us today. Stay connected to the true vine, the one that really does provide nourishment for you.